It's November of 1999 and you're just 10 years old. You come home after school and park yourself in front of the TV to be greeted by a lineup featuring Rugrats, SpongeBob, and a zany show about something called a CatDog. You love Nickelodeon so much that you're subscribed to Nickelodeon magazine. Every month you tear open the latest issue to read the hottest news about cartoons, games, and movies, and of course work yourself into a frenzy over all the cool advertisements made iconic by their unique 90s aesthetic. There's something different about the November 1999 issue though, something that would invoke a mystery still discussed in secluded circles of the internet to this day. You turn the page and see a full spread advertisement. CatDog is going virtual with not one but 2 video games. CatDog Quest for the Golden Hydrant has just released this very month and looks like an exciting Indiana Jones style adventure you cannot wait to play on the family PC. The second game is for the PlayStation, but it doesn't seem to be available yet, giving you a tantalizing tease thanks to an eye-catching purple coming soon sticker. Eventually your parents relent to all of your nagging and you find Quest for the Golden Hydrant in your tiny hands, playing it so much that you could complete the game in your sleep. But there's something missing. Months go by and Quest for the Golden Hydrant isn't scratching that itch anymore. Something's lingering in the air, but you can't quite put your finger on it. Then it hits you while absent-mindedly browsing through an old Nickelodeon magazine. What happened to the CatDog game for PlayStation? Didn't they say it was coming soon? Being a true 90s kid, you head to the internet to try and find some answers, but all you find is more questions. The only scrap of information you find is a preview of the game from February of 2000, estimating the game's release date as May 2000, a date that has come and gone. As the calendar ticks by, you start to forget all about this mythical CatDog game, and why wouldn't you? The PlayStation 2 is here, bringing a bunch of shiny new Nickelodeon games to play. Who cares about a silly old CatDog game? Years go by until a tweet you almost scroll past catches your eye. Art of Lost and Cancelled Media is the author. Lost CatDog game. PlayStation. Memories come flooding back and you remember the excitement and curiosity of 12 years ago when you first saw this exact image. Then you ask yourself, what happened to CatDog saving Mean Bob? Lost media, it's a subject that has gained serious popularity thanks to a flourishing subset of YouTube creators and the Lost Media Wiki. These days, it feels like you can't go 5 minutes without another major discovery of something that seemed to be lost for good. But what actually is lost media? Well, the explanation is right in the name. Lost media is any piece of media that is not accessible to the general public anymore. In my experience, the most common forms of lost media seem to be TV shows and games. The more interesting question is, why does so much media become lost? For those of you born in the new millennium, it probably seems absurd that any piece of professionally made media could just disappear. Generally, a piece of lost media falls into one of 2 categories, the first of which is that the media wasn't popular during its release. In the age of iTunes, Amazon, and online streaming services, it's tough to imagine something could vanish without a trace. The most irrelevant pieces of media these days will either be available for purchase through a digital storefront, wind up on streaming services as a way to pad out a catalogue, or all else failing, it'll be illegally uploaded somewhere. But it wasn't that long ago that media preservation was a very spotty area. If a TV show in the 80s came out and was a massive flop, it wasn't going to receive a home video release. Unless somebody recorded the show while it aired, it was so easy for a lot of these obscure shows to drift off into the ether. Media preservation is something that big companies still don't care about much. To this day, a lot of that is left up to fans doing it through methods that are technically illegal, but allow for somebody's hard work to never truly be forgotten. When it comes to video games, this is a big issue that still rears its ugly head from time to time. In my efforts to cover every Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon game ever made, I've encountered plenty of games made in the last 5 to 10 years that are impossible to obtain legally anymore, thanks to being removed from digital storefronts due to licensing deals expiring. So when you consider all that, it's not surprising that lost media is such a hot topic these days. The second category I most often see lost media falling into, particularly when it comes to video games, is cancellation. There is nothing more tantalizing than a game that was advertised and promoted, only to disappear and never find its way into players' hands. Video game history is littered with examples of this. You can find so many cancelled lost media games that were actually given to reviewers, like the infamous NBA Elite 11. This was supposed to be the revitalization of EA's flagship NBA series, which had fallen behind rival publisher 2K's very own basketball series. After a bug-filled demo which spawned the infamous Andrew Bynum T-pose video, NBA Elite 11 faced intense scrutiny, causing EA to cancel it entirely, but not before review copies were handed out to the press. I think what makes this kind of lost media so special is the allure and mystery behind it. Because the game was never released, it remains an unknown quantity. Sure, Mean Girls on the Nintendo DS was probably just going to be shovelware, but it also could have been a hidden gem of the platform. You also have the most important mystery of all: why did the game never release? In NBA Elite 11's case, you got an answer, but when the video game industry was a little younger and the internet was in its infancy, video game coverage was so spotty that publishers could get away with just ghosting fans. Ask anybody who grew up gaming through the 90s and early 2000s, and they probably have at least one story of seeing an ad for a game, getting excited, but then never seeing the game release. CatDog Saving Mean Bob is one such game that falls into this category. It popped up into the lives of a group of very specific kids, but then quickly faded away. Coming across Saving Mean Bob through the course of my Nickelodeon video game history series intrigued me. I wanted to know more about this mysterious game and why it never released. This curiosity kept building and building until eventually I had to try and get to the bottom of it. This is my journey into finding CatDog Saving Mean Bob. When I set out to uncover the mystery of Saving Mean Bob, I decided to start with the facts, no matter how few were available. What do we actually know about this game? My first stop was the Lost Media Wiki, a fantastic resource that I was sure would have all available info in one convenient location. However, things immediately start getting messy as soon as you begin reading Saving Mean Bob's entry. First off, the opening sentence mentions the game would have been on PlayStation and PC. I haven't found a single shred of evidence that indicated this would be on any platform other than the PS1. The advertisement for the game goes out of its way to only mention the PS1, so I'm not sure where they're pulling this info from. The page goes on to claim Robert Lamoureux worked on the game in addition to working on CatDog Quest for the Golden Hydrant, the game that actually came out. Robert Lamoureux was a writer on CatDog, so it would make sense that he could see involvement in these games in some capacity, but again, the Lost Media Wiki provides no evidence or sources for this. In general, the page for Saving Mean Bob is full of claims and so-called facts, without a lot of sources to back things up. The next fact known about the game was that it was being developed by Nowhere, with a link to a listing on IGN as the reference. What we know for sure is correct is that the game was being published by Hasbro Interactive, as could clearly be seen in the Nickelodeon magazine advertisement. The page goes on to theorise about why the game was never released, and mentions that it was seemingly far along in production due to the existence of a page on Blockbuster's website, mentions in Billboard magazine, and a press preview of the game. Let's examine this page and its info a little closer. The first thing I want to bring up is the box art used by Lost Media Wiki. Compare this to the box art featured in the advertisement. They are completely different. Of course, the Lost Media Wiki page provides no source for where this box art came from. You might dismiss this as some sort of fake or a mock-up, but that doesn't make too much sense. Firstly, we already have confirmed box art thanks to the advertisement. Secondly, the box art is just way too well made to be a fake. As far as I'm concerned, 2 box arts exist for the game for some reason. Next up, let's look at the 2 screenshots of the game featured in the advertisement. They really don't give you much of an idea about the game. They simply show CatDog standing in front of two backgrounds, one of which appears to be their house. I guess we can take away that the game would have been 2D. It certainly looks that way based purely on these images. Jumping into the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, we're able to get a solid look at the Blockbuster page for CatDog Saving Mean Bob. To my dismay, it doesn't reveal too much info. It merely says that it's an action game, was supposed to release in 2000, was a one-player game, and was rated E for everyone. Similarly, the mention in Billboard magazine is more clutching at straws. The February 2000 issue featured an article about children being targeted by video game companies. The article interviews John Hurlbut, a senior vice president / general manager of Hasbro Interactive at the time. Later in the piece, the writer lists a number of Hasbro Interactive published games that are in the works, including Action Man, Nicktoons Racing, and of course, CatDog Saving Mean Bob. It's not much, but it does confirm that the project was still well and truly alive as of February of 2000. The most interesting reference on the Saving Mean Bob Lost Media wiki page is the link to PSX Nation, a website that was owned by IGN. Clicking on it transports you back to the 90s, March 11, 1999 to be exact. This is a very primitive article announcing that a CatDog game is in development, with work being done by Terraglyph Interactive and publishing by Hasbro Interactive. This is the first known mention of the game. Things start getting really juicy when you take a close look at the only known preview from a video game outlet. I believe this preview was the most recent update in the Saving Mean Bob mystery, having been discovered in late 2019. It was also published by PSX Nation, a PlayStation-focused site. This preview is arguably the holy grail of Saving Mean Bob info, particularly because it contradicts a lot of other sources and supposed facts about the game. The developer listed here is not Nowhere, but instead Terraglyph, just like they mentioned in their initial article. This is extremely odd considering they're contradicting IGN. Essentially, they were contradicting themselves with this preview. Why has Nowhere been so confidently listed as this game's developer? The info box then claims that 2 players could join in on the action of Saving Mean Bob, contradicting the Blockbuster listing. Lastly, the approximate release date is said to be May 2000. It's incredibly intriguing to note PSX Nation explicitly said this was an approximate release date. Clearly the release wasn't set in stone when this was written. As for the preview itself, that's even more enlightening. It starts by explaining the basic concept of what CatDog is, before describing the narrative of the game.
Cat has carelessly thrown away Mean Bob, Dog's favorite action figure, and now he's on a mission to get it back. It's fast action, leading CatDog all over Nearburg to 6 different locations. CatDog's house, the streets of Nearburg, Cavity Crunch Cereal Factory, the Dog Pound, Beather Bottom Boutique, Taco Depot, and the City Dump. Venture through all the locations and levels to find the tools needed to save Mean Bob.
So we know the basic plot of the game, which I guess was already known considering the game's title is pretty self-explanatory. We also find out that there would be 6 locations, however the preview strangely names 7 locations. It also seems you would have been collecting various items on your journey to get Mean Bob back. Sounds like some sort of power-up mechanic that progressively makes the player more powerful. However, my favourite nugget of info comes after all of this.
One cool feature is that players can either play alone or cooperatively, with each controlling half.
This simultaneously sounds so cool and absolutely insane. I have no idea how that would even work in a way that would be enjoyable, especially on a more primitive platform like the PS1. Perhaps we've unearthed a tidbit that could explain why the game encountered troubles. This mechanic sounds like a nightmare to get working. The preview then ends with this.
Hasbro hasn't released too much information about this title, other than its planned April release.
This closing statement is incredibly revealing. Firstly, it's obvious that the planned release date was supposed to be April, but was pushed back to May and the game info box was changed to reflect that. The bottom of the article has a last updated February 22, 2000 message, so we can comfortably assume it was around this date that Hasbro Interactive delayed the game. It's also clear based on the way the preview is written that the writer was pretty much just regurgitating a press release given to them by Hasbro Interactive. They never actually went hands-on with the game. So we got this whirlwind of info with plenty of contradicting statements, but I haven't even got to the real goldmine yet, the screenshots. This preview was accompanied by not 1 or 2 images, but 6 brand new unique screenshots. and shockingly, they look nothing like the images from the Nickelodeon magazine ad. Instead, it shows off that this was clearly going to be some sort of 3D action or platformer game. The first image shows CatDog surfing in what appears to be a giant bathtub. I'm not really sure what level this would have been from, but the surfboard could have been one of the tools you collect on your journey. The second screenshot seems to confirm this, as CatDog is seen surfing in a different area. The third screenshot shows CatDog standing on what appears to be a bed in the middle of a river. Again, I can't really place which location this screenshot belongs to. Screenshot 4 has CatDog in some sort of old-timey mine shaft. If I had to guess, maybe this was the city dump? Screenshot 5 definitely shows off the city dump though, as CatDog is seen running around some stacks of tyres with a swinging hazard just up ahead. Our final screenshot seems to show CatDog jumping out of a grate, with security guards approaching. Maybe this was the dog pound level? In screenshots 1 and 3 you get a glimpse at the game's HUD. It shows off that you collected fish in the game, which I'm assuming would grant the player an extra life when 100 were collected. You can see the life counter in the top left too. Then there's a countdown timer, showing that at least portions of the game had to be completed within a certain time limit. Lastly, it's a little off screen, but it seems like whatever is in the bottom right corner may have been displaying which tool or item you were currently using. This PSX Nation preview is the motherlode when it comes to CatDog information currently available. It's basically one of the only sources of legitimate information. A big question I was left with after investigating this webpage within an inch of its life was what's up with the drastically different sets of screenshots? My first thought was that maybe every screenshot featured on the Nick magazine advertisement was from Quest for the Golden Hydrant, but after sitting through a full playthrough I can confirm the screenshots are not from that game. I was then left with two theories. My first was that the game went through a majorly turbulent development cycle where they drastically changed what the game was going to be at some point. Clearly the development wasn't smooth, seeing as the game was never released, so a major retooling would make sense. My second theory is that these were screenshots of 2D cutscenes that were designed to mimic the show. This would explain the significant difference in style. The images would still be a little weird if that second theory was correct though. Why are the screenshots so zoomed out? CatDog is tiny in them. After looking at all of the currently available info, I was left with more questions than answers. To get answers to these questions, I needed to go behind the scenes and find out more about the companies who were making the game. This would be the key to everything. The one fact I wanted to nail down more than anything before proceeding further with my research was which companies were actually working on saving Mean Bob. So much of my research was going to be tied to these two companies, so straightening it all out was top priority. As we already definitively know, Hasbro Interactive had acquired the CatDog IP for use in video games and was the publisher here. Hasbro Interactive was the video game development and publishing arm of toy giant Hasbro. Throughout the early 90s, they had seen immense success in the video game space with virtual adaptations of their hit board games like Monopoly and Scrabble. This success opened their eyes to the potential of video games, and they decided they wanted to take full advantage of their IP, opening Hasbro Interactive in 1995. These early endeavours brought incredible returns for the company. By 1997, they had revenue of $86 million and had their eyes on expansion. They wanted to go from releasing video games based on their board games or toys to being a genuine player in the video game industry. This ambition resulted in the acquisition of Microprose, a developer known for creating the popular Sid Meier's Civilization series, as well as the rights to the Atari brand. Hasbro Interactive continued going from strength to strength, increasing revenue by 127% in 1998 and making a profit of $23 million. Business was booming. In the space of just 3 years, Hasbro, a giant in the board game and toy space, had now conquered the video game industry. Firmly established as one of the major players in the late 90s, it seemed like the sky was the limit. Unfortunately, 1999 was a disastrous year for the company. They would lose $74 million, a stark turnaround from the year prior. In the blink of an eye, they went from rapidly expanding to laying off employees. In the wake of these poor financial numbers, Hasbro Interactive was forced to shut down several studios to save costs, including a number of offices that were involved with Microprose. To this day, the stability of the games industry is volatile at best, with ridiculously short periods of poor performance potentially spelling doom for companies. This was made even worse at the dawn of the new millennium when the dot-com bubble burst. This was something that played out over months and years, but it really exploded around March of 2000, which is right around the time CatDog was planning to release. This economic turbulence resulted in Hasbro's share price dropping astronomically in a short period of time. Faced with a company that was seemingly in a death spiral, a radical decision was made. Hasbro Interactive would be sold. On January 29, 2001, French company Infogrames completed the purchase of Hasbro Interactive from Hasbro. This sale included almost all of their video game related rights and properties, the Atari brand, Hasbro's Game.com division, and developer Microprose, along with all of the software they had previously developed. Infogrames paid $100 million for Hasbro Interactive, 95 million of which came through as 4.5 million shares of Infogrames, as well as $5 million in cash to round it out. After the purchase, Hasbro Interactive would initially be renamed Infogrames Interactive, but this wouldn't last long. One of Infogrames' big projects launched in the wake of this purchase was relaunching the Atari brand. This led to the company being renamed to Atari Interactive in May of 2003. In the space of 3 years, Hasbro Interactive went from top of the industry to no longer existing. But why is it important to know the history of Hasbro Interactive? Well, that will come into play in some crucial ways later on. For now, let's shift our focus to the first developer tangled up in the Saving Mean Bob mystery. Practically everywhere you look on the internet will tell you Nowhere were developing Saving Mean Bob. This dubious fact seems to stem from IGN's listing of the game and has spread like wildfire from there. When you actually dig into Nowhere's history, their link to being the developer is incredibly dubious. They were a relatively notable PC game developer throughout the 90s. Their focus was mainly on educational games for kids, but would end up dabbling in licensed IP. Nowhere developed Rugrats Mystery Adventures in 1999, as well as CatDog Quest for the Golden Hydrant, the other CatDog game promoted in the now infamous magazine ad. This is where the confusion stems from. Quest for the Golden Hydrant was released on November 2 of 1999, exclusively for the PC, with Hasbro Interactive serving as the publisher as they had the rights to the IP. It's a pretty unremarkable game that boils down to little more than being a collection of 6 minigames. However, it's played a massive role in the Saving Mean Bob mystery. The fact that Nowhere were developing Quest for the Golden Hydrant around the same time Saving Mean Bob was in development is almost certainly the reason why they were dragged into this mess. It's a mix-up that happens quite frequently. Nowhere is 100% not Saving Mean Bob's developer. The true developer of the game is the second and much less frequently mentioned company, Terraglyph Interactive Studios. Terraglyph also enters this mess via IGN, strangely enough. Their PSX Nation article and preview of the game are practically the only sources that state Saving Mean Bob was developed by Terraglyph. The fact that PSX Nation wrote an article and a preview of the game means at one point they were in close contact with people involved in making the game. They clearly knew who was making the game. It's a much more convincing source than a bunch of random online listings. Terraglyph Interactive Studios was a fascinating developer. Located in Schaumburg, Illinois, it was founded in 1994 and was the game dev arm of the Terraglyph group of companies. This conglomerate covered a number of industries, including a web/media services division, a business visualization company, and a feature animation studio that was located in Dublin, Ireland. Initially, Terraglyph Interactive Studios focused on educational PC games for children, much like Nowhere. They were developing titles based on classic fairy tales such as Hansel and Gretel, but would eventually transition to focusing on licensed IP, particularly with their acquisition of the Tiny Toons rights. Their work on Tiny Toons games actually drew the attention of Steven Spielberg, who was the show's executive producer. This resulted in him meeting with Terraglyph's CEO in 1995. As I was researching Terraglyph, I was initially drawing upon Wikipedia as a launching off point, but quickly hit a pretty big speed bump. According to this page, the game dev portion of Terraglyph went out of business in early 1997 due to disappointing sales of their games. If this was the case, why were they listed as the developer of a game releasing 3 years later? It gets even stranger when you find out Terraglyph released 7 games after they were supposed to be dissolved. My initial thought was that maybe the person who wrote this miscommunicated that Terraglyph, the parent company, had cut ties with the game studio portion, making them independent. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense though, because Terraglyph Interactive Studios would work on an adaptation of Carnivale in 1999, which was a Terraglyph film. And if you needed more proof that they didn't go out of business in 1997, here's a listing for the company on GameSpy that mentioned the company had financial troubles and went out of business in 2001. There are no references or sources for this line on Wikipedia, so it appears somebody just pulled this info out of thin air. It's such a strange piece of information to make up. As I continued to research Terraglyph, I couldn't find any other sources outside of PSX Nation that said they were developing Saving Mean Bob. However, I did learn that they were also linked to another mysterious game from the same era. As I just briefly mentioned, they were developing a Nintendo 64 game based on Carnivale, an animated film starring Helena Bonham Carter and Hugh Laurie that was never released in the US. This game was actually shown off at E3 1999 and seemed like it was an attempt from Terraglyph to get some synergy going between two different arms of the company. This game would never see the light of day though. Unseen64 has a pretty in-depth article about the game and features an interesting quote.
Sadly, Carnival's development team, Terraglyph, was being reorganized at that time, and many employees were fired, and the game vanished without traces.
This quote led me to the website NES World, which had unearthed a playable version of Carnivale. Not only did this give me hope for potentially discovering a playable version of Saving Mean Bob, but NES World's brilliant write-up on Carnivale provides some hugely revealing tidbits about the state of Terraglyph around the time Saving Mean Bob was in development.
Carnival, a piece of software based on a movie that was never released, has suffered some serious development problems that have directly affected the game's progress.
This quote comes from a September 2000 IGN article where they spoke to a representative from Vatical Entertainment, the company working with Terraglyph to publish Carnivale. The article continues on,
"The studio creating Carnival, Terraglyph Interactive, recently laid off a major portion of its teams and was unable to complete the title. As it stands, Carnival is an estimated 50 to 60% complete, according to Vatical, and the company is currently deciding whether or not to transfer the remaining work to a new developer and release it, or simply cancel it altogether."
This article is a revealing look into the state of Terraglyph around the time Saving Mean Bob was being worked on. It's also quite awkward that Vatical were considering transferring the development of a game based on a Terraglyph film away from Terraglyph. Also mentioned in this article is the cancellation of VR Powerboat. The Nintendo 64 version of this game was slated to be developed by Terraglyph, but according to the article, Vatical cancelled it before development really even got underway. Saving Mean Bob was allegedly supposed to release in early to mid 2000, which is when these layoffs and financial troubles would have been stirring. This could be a potential explanation for why the game was never released. Armed with my newfound knowledge about Hasbro Interactive and Terraglyph's history, it was time to get down to business and do some hardcore research. I was going to find out what happened to Saving Mean Bob once and for all. While the hard work of a lot of other lost media enthusiasts had revealed some solid information regarding the mystery of CatDog Saving Mean Bob, it was time for me to get my own hands dirty in this search. My first attempts were all big letdowns. I started by reverse image searching the recently unearthed screenshots from the PSX Nation preview. This revealed nothing. I then did the same thing for the Nickelodeon magazine advertisement, which similarly provided me with absolutely nothing. But while conducting that search, an idea popped into my head. Why not check out more issues of Nickelodeon magazine? I grew up on magazines like this and they would constantly reuse advertisements for months at a time, so maybe this could give us some sort of insight into Saving Mean Bob's development and marketing. As luck would have it, I found a complete archive of the November 1999 issue that this now infamous ad appeared in. I read through the entire issue and found a tiny little nugget. It wasn't much, but it was something to get this search heading in the right direction. Towards the end of the magazine, there's a directory that makes note of every advertisement featured in the issue. This includes CatDog Saving Mean Bob. It reads, "CatDog and friends spring to life in two different wacky adventures. You control the zany action in Quest for the Golden Hydrant for PC CD-ROM, and Saving Mean Bob coming soon to the PlayStation game console." I was convinced that couldn't be the only mention of Saving Mean Bob in Nickelodeon magazine. What are the odds that Nickelodeon would only run this advertisement once in their own magazine? I read through half a dozen archived issues from around this time, but there wasn't a single CatDog video game ad in any of them. I did find a bunch of advertisements for other Nickelodeon games, and the November 2000 issue had an ad for Scooby-Doo Classic Creep Capers, which was developed by Terraglyph. I'd struck out with Nickelodeon magazine, but digging up old magazine archives got me thinking, what if other, more video game focused magazines could be a source of info? I immediately turned my attention to video game magazines from that era, desperate to find more advertisements or even another preview like the one seen on PSX Nation. Official US PlayStation magazine was my first stop, largely because it had the most complete archive of any of the magazines. I was searching from late 1998 to 2001, and most of these issues were available online, with a few exceptions. This is the closest I'd get to a snapshot of the gaming landscape around the time of Saving Mean Bob's development. Quickly, this became a massive rabbit hole. The first mention of Saving Mean Bob in official US PlayStation magazine comes in the June 1999 issue. The future releases section they included every month merely mentions CatDog is coming. There was seemingly no subtitle attached to the game at this point, but I believe this is the earliest known mention of the game that would become Saving Mean Bob outside of the March PSX Nation article. The very next month in the July 1999 issue, CatDog is mentioned in the exact same section yet again. However, in August, it mysteriously disappears from the list entirely. September and October feature no mentions of CatDog whatsoever, but in November, the same month as the Nick magazine ad, it returns to the future releases section. Curiously, it's still without a subtitle in this mention. Also in the same issue is a full-page ad for a Tiny Toons game developed by Terraglyph. At this point, I was analysing every inch of these magazines, convinced some sort of info about Saving Mean Bob was going to jump out at me. CatDog is mentioned again in the exact same way in December, but things take a major change as we click over into the new millennium. In the January 2000 issue, CatDog is once again mentioned, but not in the future releases section. Instead, it's listed as a January release, and to top it all off, the game has finally received the Saving Mean Bob subtitle for its part in this section. Obviously, the game didn't release in January. The story is exactly the same in February. CatDog Saving Mean Bob is listed as coming out that month, but the release date comes and goes without a game coming to fruition. This is fascinating to me. Clearly the team at official US PlayStation magazine must have had some sort of contact with people working on the game, most likely Hasbro Interactive, as they would handle all the marketing. They went from listing it as coming soon to coming January and February. It would be incredibly strange for them to be making these updates without having received word from the publisher. What this tells me is that Saving Mean Bob was somewhat close to completion, and the companies involved were trying to get the game out the door at the start of 2000. In the same February issue, Toonenstein, the Terraglyph game that had received a full-page ad, was reviewed. It received a 2.5 out of 5. Unfortunately, two of the issues of official US PlayStation magazine that have never been archived are the March and April 2000 issues. If anybody happens to own copies of these two issues, I beg you to get in touch. There's potentially a goldmine waiting inside those magazines. While my search through the magazine archives hit a speed bump, Saving Mean Bob was being mentioned in other places around this time. The PSX Nation preview went up sometime before late February of 2000, and it was also mentioned in Billboard magazine in that same month. Seeing this mention, I decided to see if Saving Mean Bob was ever mentioned in Billboard again, and to my surprise, it was. On March 25, it gets mentioned in a second Billboard article, but strangely, this article almost feels like a repeat of the February article. They're both about the licensing of kids' properties. It was strange, but seeing all of these developments happening around the first 3 months of 2000 signaled to me that Hasbro Interactive were really pushing for the game to get out the door. Surely that meant the game was close to completion. Without a March or April archived issue, I skipped ahead to May of 2000. Coincidentally, this was also the month that the game was supposedly going to be released, according to the PSX Nation preview. Disappointingly, this issue was business as usual. CatDog Saving Mean Bob was once again listed to come out that very same month. I assume March and April were much the same. It seems like Saving Mean Bob progressed to the point where Hasbro was getting the hype train ready, but they hit some sort of major snag to begin 2000. Was this a result of Hasbro's financial woes? The trail goes cold in June. The game disappears from the release calendar, never to be heard from again. I refused to believe Saving Mean Bob wasn't basically complete at this point. Why would Hasbro Interactive be spruiking the game in Billboard magazine articles and updating its scheduled release date for media? My dive through the official US PlayStation magazine archives had given me renewed energy. I felt like I was so close to hitting the motherlode here. As I searched through those old issues, I dreamed of finding a preview feature or an advertisement or even gameplay footage on a demo disc. None of that came to fruition, and the archives for all other prominent PlayStation magazines at the time were so bare bones. I turned my attention to EGM, who were owned by the same parent company as official US PlayStation magazine, but were focused on all platforms rather than just PlayStation. I couldn't find a single mention, not even in their upcoming releases section from November 1999 to May 2000. Having looked through a few different outlets now, I was perplexed. Why did seemingly one outlet get preview access to the game? It's so strange. With the video game magazine trail going cold, I returned to the vast ocean that is the internet. Firing up reverse image search again, I decided to see if I couldn't find the source of the random box art image that wasn't featured on the advertisement. To my surprise, I found something. I unearthed an ancient CatDog fan site where the owner had supposedly interviewed Robert Lamoureux, the same Robert Lamoureux who apparently wrote for Saving Mean Bob. The actual interview on the site makes no mention of Saving Mean Bob. The only mention comes during a little blurb at the end that says Robert has helped with writing on the CD-ROM game The Golden Hydrant and PlayStation's Saving Mean Bob. As far as I can tell, this is the source of the claim that Robert Lamoureux was involved, which has been parroted across numerous websites. Why none of them ever linked to this source, I'll never know. I also have no idea when this interview took place. The page makes no mention of the date, and I couldn't unearth anything despite trying a bunch of methods. The website also features the mysterious alternate box art. It's the only source I've been able to find that features it. Where did the fansite owner get this? It appears literally nowhere else except on this obscure fansite. It looks way too convincing to be a fake, especially for something made in the early 2000s. Maybe Robert Lamoureux passed this on? A significant portion of our known facts about Saving Mean Bob come from this interview. It's shocking that nobody decided it would be a good idea to link to it. My next plan of attack was to jump into the Wayback Machine. This could be super useful in digging up old content that is no longer accessible through typical search methods. I decided I'd look at the websites for both companies involved in making the game. Maybe they'd promoted their work there. The Wayback Machine turned up nothing usable from Hasbro Interactive's website, but Terraglyphs was a little more revealing. At first I found just a logo, but very quickly I was bouncing around their website, looking at different sections and even some contact info. It didn't mention anything about Saving Mean Bob, but I now had a couple of names of people confirmed to be working at Terraglyph. I turned my Wayback Machine focus to other gaming websites. After all, the PSX Nation preview was found via this method, rather than just Googling. Looking at archived listings of Saving Mean Bob from GameSpy and IGN, the developer for the game is listed as nowhere. This is so bizarre. I can only assume that Quest for the Golden Hydrant's release around the exact same time caused major confusion, especially because everything surrounding Saving Mean Bob is such a mystery. Outside of those weird listings for the game, no new information could be found. I'd officially hit the bottom of the barrel, so decided to take a look at the ratings boards to see if I could uncover anything. Saving Mean Bob had been rated by the ESRB at some point. Surely this means the game was close to completion, right? How could you rate the game otherwise? Unfortunately, the ESRB's page has literally no info other than the game contained comic mischief and contained no interactive elements. It's interesting to note that Quest for the Golden Hydrant has the same amount of information on its page. It also doesn't say when it was rated. And with that final shot in the dark, I'd run out of leads to chase. It felt like I'd searched the entire internet, and while I'd found some interesting mentions of Saving Mean Bob in regards to release dates and the source of some of the reported facts, there wasn't anything groundbreaking. At most, I dug up info that could maybe allow us to hypothesize about how close Saving Mean Bob was to completion. I was left pretty deflated, but I still had one ace left up my sleeve. It was time to resort to the plan B of just about every lost media investigation about video games ever made. I was going to message every single person I could find who was even slightly linked to Saving Mean Bob. My resource of choice for this task was LinkedIn, Not only would it give me a reliable source of contact info, but somebody may have also mentioned they worked on the game in their resume, even if the game never released. Because Saving Mean Bob never hit store shelves and Terraglyph had been out of business for so long, this was pretty much the only reliable method I had of contacting somebody who worked on the game. To my surprise, I didn't find a single person who mentioned they worked on Saving Mean Bob. I thought this was a little odd, especially because I found employees who mentioned their work on Carnivale, which was also unreleased. At this point, I was starting to question if the game ever even existed. So I sent out messages to Terraglyph and Hasbro Interactive employees. In total, I ended up messaging around 40 people who potentially had knowledge of the game. These ranged from CEOs and founders of the companies to people who only worked there for a handful of months. Because of the way LinkedIn works, I actually didn't have permission to randomly initiate a message with the majority of these contacts I found. That kind of power is locked behind LinkedIn Premium. Thankfully, LinkedIn had been pestering me to do a 1-month trial of Premium for years now, so I activated that, blasted out my messages, and then waited. It turned out that I wouldn't have to wait long for responses, receiving a bunch of replies within hours. I expected to be waiting days, if not weeks, for replies, but people seemed eager to talk. Unfortunately, the responses were less than promising at first.
I wasn't aware of this game while I worked there, so I can't confirm.
Randall Skatch, lead sound designer at Terraglyph.
To my recollection, I was working on another game during that time. Truthfully, I'm not in a position to help your project.
Pascal St. Clair, computer and traditional artist at Terraglyph.
Wow, a blast from the past. Haven't heard the name Terraglyph in a while. Unfortunately, I didn't directly work on it, but I remember hearing the CatDog project thrown around. I wasn't on that team though, so I don't have any more information.
Joel Dang, 3D animator at Terraglyph.
Can't remember working on CatDog. Sorry.
Bruce Riley, vice president of sales and business development at Terraglyph.
I don't remember that game being worked on. I was working on other projects at the time. The person that would know, and could probably give you more information, was the creative director who had his hand in all the projects. His name is Dick Thorne. I hope that helps. Sorry I can't provide more info.
Brad Delaney, producer at Terraglyph. Dick Thorne was actually one of the names mentioned on the old Terraglyph website I accessed via the Wayback Machine, so I'd already identified him as a person of interest. However, it was positive to see that people were so receptive to my inquiries. They might not be able to help me directly, but they were trying to push me in the right direction where they could. One thing I found truly fascinating in these early responses was that so many employees working at Terraglyph during Saving Mean Bob's development had no idea that it existed. Perhaps PSX Nation was somehow wrong and Terraglyph wasn't the real developer? Responses then started to trickle in from the Hasbro Interactive side of the equation. I knew for sure they were involved with the game, but they were an exponentially bigger company working on way more projects, making it far less likely that I was going to find the people directly working on Saving Mean Bob. If finding a developer who worked on Saving Mean Bob was like finding a needle in a haystack, finding a Hasbro employee that worked on CatDog would be like finding a specific grain of sand on the world's largest beach.
Since I was at the MicroProse office at Hasbro Interactive, I had never heard about that game even being in development. We were working on XCOM Genesis at the time, which was a strategy combat title. A bit far removed from something like CatDog. Sorry I can't be of any help with this subject matter, but I wish you the best with your research.
Eric Peterson, art director at Hasbro Interactive.
Sorry, no knowledge of this game.
Robin Matthews, studio head at Hasbro Interactive.
Try Diane Showhat. She was the kids' games executive producer at Hasbro Interactive.
Tom Dusenberry, CEO and founder of Hasbro Interactive. After striking out with a lot of Hasbro Interactive employees, I finally got the smallest glimmer of hope when I spoke to Frank Fay, a senior product manager at the company.
Hey Brandon, amazing that somebody remembers. Unfortunately, I have not much info about it. It was on our release list and then it suddenly disappeared. I believe it was for PS1 and PC. I can suggest reaching out to Tom Dusenberry. He was the CEO of Hasbro Interactive. Sorry for being no better help, all the best for your research.
I was intrigued by Frank's comment that Saving Mean Bob suddenly disappeared. Surely those working at the publisher of the game would know why it vanished. As you've heard, I'd already spoken to Tom Dusenberry. Tom's resume actually mentioned working on securing the Nickelodeon license for the company, but even he had no memory of Saving Mean Bob. Frank would also go on to provide me with another name at Hasbro Interactive, Chris Down, who was an executive producer. That lead was immediately a dead end.
Unfortunately, I didn't work on the game and don't have any information on who did. Sorry I'm not of more help.
It felt like I was on a wild goose chase. Almost every lead I had found just resulted in more new leads to chase, never actually finding somebody who had knowledge of the project. I decided to swing for the fences. Why not try and get in touch with Robert Lamoureux? After all, he was the only person who had ever been linked to the game in any capacity. He may have just been writing for the game and not directly involved in the technical side of development, but he could potentially have some sort of insight into why the project never fully materialized. To my surprise, I got a response pretty quickly from Robert.
It's been so long, I barely remember working on that project. I do remember co-writing a game for PC called In Search of the Golden Hydrant or something similar. I probably co-wrote the other game, but I don't recall clearly.
Not the most convincing response in the world, but I don't blame him for not having a perfect memory of the game. It was a product that never released, and realistically, how much writing could have been involved in this PS1 game? Lamoureux has been involved in writing so many projects, and can't be faulted for forgetting this. In fact, I can't fault anybody at any of these companies for not remembering. It's been over 20 years, how can you blame them for forgetting a game that old that never even released? More often than not, fans remember these kinds of things way more than the actual people working on them. For us, this is a crazy unsolved mystery. For them, it's just a troubled project they'd probably rather forget. At this point of my search, I was getting pretty dejected. The employees of all these different companies were happy to talk to me, that wasn't an issue at all, but seemingly none of them worked on Saving Mean Bob directly. How small was the Saving Mean Bob team? What happened with this project? Was there some kind of massive Nickelodeon conspiracy going on here that made them all go into hiding? Then a message hit my inbox that would alter the course of this investigation entirely and provide the most information about CatDog Saving Mean Bob we have ever seen. Hi Brandon, I'm not sure if you're joking. I did indeed briefly work on CatDog Saving Mean Bob. I can share my experience with you. This was Ralph Melgoza, who was listed as a 3D artist for Terraglyph. According to LinkedIn, he only worked at the company for about a year. His response was huge and I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was the first time anybody had ever confidently confirmed that they worked on CatDog Saving Mean Bob. Furthermore, it cemented the fact that Terraglyph were the real developers of the game. I had so many questions for him. It felt like I was so close to getting answers to a 2 decades long mystery. I thanked him for his response, assured him that I was not joking, and then sent through a list of questions, hoping I'd be able to get a solid answer for even just one of them. Then I waited. Ralph's reply was quick, but also not as enlightening as I'd dreamed it would be. Ralph told me that he helped out with level and asset building, as well as providing a couple of names he knew definitely worked on the game, one of which I'd already contacted but hadn't heard from, the other I simply couldn't find on LinkedIn. However, he didn't give me any of the juicy info I wanted. I wanted to know why the game didn't release, what the game would play like, and how close the game was to completion. He replied to me stating he'd prefer to chat over the phone rather than go back and forth via messages. This is kind of tough seeing as I'm in Australia, so I suggested a Zoom call or something similar instead. So we set up a time to chat. Finally, it seemed like I was going to get some answers. And then he seemingly ghosted me. Our arranged time for the chat came and went, and now he wasn't returning my messages. Thankfully, he messaged me the next day. A broken refrigerator was the culprit for missing our scheduled interview, so we rescheduled and I was finally about to get some answers for this mystery. Right off the bat, I wanted to get an understanding of what his role was at Terraglyph and on Saving Mean Bob specifically. He told me that he was initially hired to work on Carnivale. Because that project wasn't coming together, they put him on CatDog, which was already in progress at that point. I was just creating assets for the game and building the backgrounds based off the designer's concept. The project I was initially hired for never really came about, so they put me on CatDog. CatDog was already in progress by that point. After learning about his role with Terraglyph, I then asked him to dive into Saving Mean Bob's development process. I was intrigued to hear what was going on behind the scenes and hopefully get a glimpse at why CatDog never released. The first thing I wanted to know about Terraglyph was why so many Terraglyph employees who worked at the company between 1999 and 2001 had no recollection of this game at all. It seems strange to me. Surely developers would talk amongst each other about what they were working on. I asked him if it was normal at Terraglyph for employees to not know what other teams were working on. Not really. I find that kind of surprising. You had 2 different divisions, a 2D division and a 3D division. It was a relatively small building, they were in another section, but if they didn't know, it was probably because they were just focused on what they were doing, whereas I'm the type of person who wants to know what's going on with other games. I guess that makes sense. Terraglyph seemed to have plenty of games in the pipeline at all times, so it could be pretty easy to not really know about everything. As soon as Ralph started talking about CatDog's development, it became clear the game was in trouble from the moment it was conceived. I remember being in a meeting for CatDog and they had almost all of the development crew from Terraglyph there, meeting with the publisher. Management at Terraglyph basically said, here are all the people who are going to work on CatDog, but it wasn't true. It was really only maybe 7 people that worked on the game, so we were under the gun to get the game done. Our conversation also made it pretty clear that saving Mean Bob wasn't a project Terraglyph's higher-ups placed much priority on. It didn't have as much focus as the Tiny Toons Toonenstein game that was in development prior. There were more people on that. Scooby-Doo was in development too. I guess there was probably less excitement about the game within the company. The reasons behind saving Mean Bob's demise were already becoming clear. Few resources, plenty of other projects being developed, being low on the list of priorities. This game was not being set up to succeed. Development on Saving Mean Bob was so turbulent that they flew in a programmer from the UK, resulting in a humorous anecdote. One of the lead programmers was from the UK, so he was programming remotely. Terraglyph made him come in and they put him in an extended stay hotel to work on this project because they were under the gun. I remember working long hours and knocking on his door late at night to tell him the work was checked in, and he'd open the door and he's playing Flight Simulator. He's not even working on the game. While the image of catching out the lead programmer playing Flight Simulator instead of doing his job is funny, behind that was clearly a development culture that was unsustainable. A number of conversations I've had with Terraglyph employees who didn't work on Saving Mean Bob, but could provide me with info about the studio, painted a pretty drab picture. Essentially, Terraglyph was operating like a house of cards. They'd take a licensed IP and start making a game, run into major issues on the project, often resulting in financial hardship that meant they couldn't employ enough people to complete their contracted game. To solve this, the attitude of higher-ups was to go out and secure more licenses, which could give the company more funding. It was just an unsustainable business model, which explains the cancellation of Carnivale and major headaches on other projects I can't mention due to anonymity. Projects becoming underfunded and understaffed led to deadlines becoming unrealistic. Massive compromises to artistic vision would have to be made to compensate, something Saving Mean Bob suffered from. I was given the levels to work on. I recall that along the way the deadlines were getting pretty tight, so the designer literally hacked off 4 of the levels, just ripped them out of the book and said, okay, we just won't do these, which didn't sit well with me. I went to upper management and was told, as long as we have this license on the box by Christmas, we'll sell X number of copies and we'll be fine. That just didn't sit well with me. That was the point where I made the decision to leave the company. Having your work ripped up just like that would be pretty devastating. That anecdote also may explain the weirdness surrounding PSX Nation's preview. It mentions the game has 6 levels, but names 7 locations. Meanwhile, the 6 screenshots they used of the game don't seem to line up too well with the locations mentioned. All signs point to a very messy development with nothing really being set in stone. And then on top of the project's mismanagement, you had the typical disagreements, speed bumps and roadblocks you'd find within video game development. There were a lot of passionate people working on it. There was an animator, Jeff Baker. He was really meticulous about getting that squash and stretch fluid animation when CatDog would jump in this platformer. The programmers struggled a little bit with it because he put so many frames of animation into it, but when you're button mashing, you want the game to be responsive. I just remember these battles between him and the programmers. He really wasn't willing to compromise the artistic vision of how animation should work. One of the biggest question marks hanging over Saving Mean Bob was the gameplay. We never saw any footage of the game, and we have 2 very contrasting sets of screenshots, one showing the game being 2D and the other clearly being 3D. Ralph didn't remember it too much, but he could clear up one point of confusion. It was all 3D. I think there may have been cutscenes that were 2D in between, but the game was all 3D. When I showed the 2D screenshots to him, he confirmed that these were the 2D cutscenes. I was thrilled to have this cleared up, and it also seems to point towards how unfinished the game was at this point. Clearly the game was in such poor shape in November of 1999 that all they had to show to the public was 2 extremely underwhelming cutscene screenshots. This made me curious. Was Saving Mean Bob ever close to a releasable state? The constant updating of the release date and PSX Nation preview made it seem like it was close, but I was having doubts now. As far as Ralph was aware, the game was far from ready while he was working on it. You mentioned there was this article put out, and I'm sure it was all just smoke and mirrors to appease the publisher. The game was not anywhere near completion when I left the company in January of 2000. If this is true, that could explain the strangeness of seemingly one outlet getting preview access. Terraglyph just gave it to PSX Nation so they could act like they were progressing along nicely when questioned by Hasbro. What I had seen was nowhere near completion or polished. It had gone through some QA, but it was still pretty rough and buggy at that time. There was a target release date, but I can't remember for sure. Again, it seems to fall back on Terraglyph management and their House of Cards business strategy. Then I hit Ralph with the most burning question. Why wasn't Saving Mean Bob released? Ralph had left the company prior to the alleged May 2000 release date, but he could potentially have some info that gives some sort of explanation. I know that year was really rough for Terraglyph. They had money problems to the point where the December of that year, the week of Christmas, they gave everybody their paychecks and everybody got calls that night saying, "Don't cash those checks, they're gonna bounce." Terraglyph's days were numbered by that point. There was some mismanagement from up above that just guided teams in the wrong direction. Even without anything definitive, I was starting to get a vivid picture of why Saving Mean Bob ultimately died. Terraglyph was an incredibly poorly run company. My chat with Ralph was fascinating and gave me incredible insight, but I wanted a concrete answer. At the end of the day, why did they just scrap this title entirely? Ralph offered to ask around and see if he could find anybody else who would be willing to talk to me for this documentary. As it turns out, his generosity led me to Andy Hansen, a member of the QA team for Saving Mean Bob. Ralph told me Andy would like to speak with me. Apparently he recalled that the game was about 75% complete before it was shut down, and that he might even have a playable version of the game. I was stunned. If what Ralph was telling me was true, I was on the verge of a huge discovery. Nobody had ever seen footage of this game, and I was potentially about to speak to somebody who had a working copy of it. I sent an email to Andy, and after a bit of waiting, he got back to me, stating he was happy to answer any questions I had. So I passed on my list of questions and waited, and waited, and waited. I sent a follow-up email to see if he was still interested, and he confirmed that he was, but he just hadn't had free time to sit down and answer my questions. He also heartbreakingly confirmed that after looking through his archives, he couldn't find a copy of the game. Taking that news like a shotgun blast to the chest, I crossed my fingers that Andy would be able to provide me with some new information. After all, he seemed to have been part of Saving Mean Bob's development to the bitter end. Andy said he would get his answers back to me by the weekend, but as of this documentary being posted, I haven't heard back from him. After my huge interview with Ralph, all I was left with was silence. I felt like I was on the cusp of a massive breakthrough, but nothing was going my way. So I went back to waiting. I'd used my free 1-month trial of LinkedIn Premium to get access to the ability to message anybody on the platform. I was giving myself until that trial expired to get something out of one of the employees. But I was starting to lose hope about getting more answers to this mystery. If most of the employees can't remember the game and less than 10 people actually worked on Saving Mean Bob, what hope did I have in learning why the game never released, let alone seeing new footage or screenshots? The next few weeks were taken up by dead ends or conversations with Terraglyph employees who didn't work on the game but could give me some background on the company. I managed to get a little tidbit from Andrea Djokovic.
Wow, CatDog, a blast from a far past. I remembered that it was in QA as we were working on other titles. The game was in some sort of functional state. It was on the original PSX, which had limitations.
Andrea's comment about the original PlayStation being limited lines up with some of the info I'd unearthed regarding CatDog's difficult development. To me, it seems like the unique nature of the CatDog character had proved to be extremely hard to animate on the PS1, another hypothesis for why Saving Mean Bob suffered its cruel fate, but no concrete proof. One Saturday morning after going for a run, I sat down and saw a magazine subscription I bought as a gift had auto-renewed without warning. I checked my spam folder on my email to see if their warning email had fallen into there, but instead I found an email from John Podlasek, who was a producer for Saving Mean Bob. In his email, he confirmed Saving Mean Bob was in production at Terraglyph and mentioned that he actually flew out to LA for the VO session with the show's cast. He also cited technical problems and the game's deadline causing issues on the project.
Confirmed. There was a game in production. I was the producer, flew out to LA for the VO session. The cast was fantastic. From what I remember, that was a long time ago. Technical challenges and an overly aggressive deadline caused a lot of the issues.
John agreed to speak to me in late September, but as September came and went, I didn't hear from him, even after I sent follow-up emails. And that was the end of the line for my search. I had scoured every corner of the internet, messaged every Terraglyph and Hasbro Interactive employee, and in the end I came up empty-handed. Sure, I found quite a lot of new, smaller pieces of info, and my interview with Ralph Malgoza was incredible, but I couldn't help feeling let down. I had become consumed by this search. I needed to know why the game was cancelled. I needed to know the full story. Unfortunately, it looked like it would remain a mystery for the time being. While I didn't have a direct answer from anybody involved with the game as to why Saving Mean Bob never saw the light of day, it did feel like I had a bunch of pieces of the puzzle. I'd had all manner of conversations with former Terraglyph employees both on and off the record, which had given me incredible insight into the culture at Terraglyph, the state of the company around the time of Saving Mean Bob's development, and of course actual details on the production of Saving Mean Bob. With all of this info at my disposal, I wanted to try and put together my own personal hypothesis as to why this game vanished into thin air. Ultimately, I think Terraglyph's management is to blame. The structure of the business as it has been described to me by multiple anonymous employees was just unsustainable. From my understanding, Terraglyph found themselves in trouble around the time of their Tunenstein game. This led to a never-ending cycle of running out of money for a project, pitching ideas for a new IP, securing the rights and getting funding to that IP, then funneling much of that funding back to the initial game that was in trouble. Unsurprisingly, using that money for a different project ultimately leaves the new game that they're working on with a thin budget, and the cycle starts over again. The final years of Terraglyph devolved into the living embodiment of that iconic Wallace and Gromit moment, where Gromit is having to lay the train tracks as he's riding the train. It seems the way they were operating really started unraveling in 2000. In 2000, both Carnivale and VR Powerboat Racing were cancelled, two projects Terraglyph had been working on. When you throw in Saving Mean Bob, they had 3 console games being developed at the same time that were caught in messy development and earned a grand total of $0 for the company. Scooby-Doo Classic Creep Capers also had a very turbulent development from what I've heard, although that did make it to store shelves. Exacerbating these mismanagement issues was the fact that the Saving Mean Bob team were having trouble getting the complex design of CatDog to animate correctly. Also around this exact time, Hasbro Interactive were undergoing their own financial troubles. The sale of Hasbro Interactive to Infogrames wasn't finalised until January of 2001, however, plans for the acquisition were first made public in early December of 2000. This was a $100 million purchase, which isn't something that happens overnight. A deal of that magnitude often goes through months and months of discussions. Additionally, Hasbro may have been in talks with other potential buyers before Infogrames came along. A common tactic when companies are prepping for a sale like this is to limit all unnecessary spending and trim the fat in various areas. You want to make your company look as profitable as possible so that you get the most money out of the sale. Prepping for this sale would have most likely coincided with CatDog trying to ramp things up for release, especially if the May release date is to be believed. Additionally, the dot-com bubble practically exploded around March of 2000, right around the time Saving Mean Bob was eyeing off completion. Terraglyph clearly did not have the money, resources, or employees to push this game out the door, and things would have been made worse by Hasbro Interactive tightening their purse strings. Terraglyph probably weren't going to receive any more money from their publisher, and I'd imagine Hasbro Interactive wouldn't have been too keen on spending a large sum of money to market the game either. With no extra money coming in, one could imagine that the executives at Terraglyph decided to cut their losses with Saving Mean Bob and try and focus on other projects that had more potential. One such title was Scooby-Doo Classic Creep Capers, like I mentioned. This was a relatively high-profile title for Terraglyph, which was going through its own development struggles. It would make sense to shift focus to that game instead. An extra bit of spice to Saving Mean Bob's downfall is that the PlayStation 2 launched in North America in October of 2000. Perhaps if the timing was different, Saving Mean Bob could have been put on the back burner and eventually completed, but if they took that path here, they'd be releasing Saving Mean Bob on an outdated console. For all we know, Saving Mean Bob might not have ever been officially cancelled. Unlike Carnivale or Powerboat, we don't have any sources that fully state this. Even the employees I've spoken to have never outright stated that the game was cancelled. Personally, I'm of the belief that most of the blame rests on Terraglyph's management for the game never releasing. Almost every employee I've spoken to has painted management in a very poor light. I think the habit of mismanaging a game's development and then signing up the rights to a new project to fund the old one seems to have caught up with them in the end. The unfortunate timing of Hasbro Interactive's sale would have been the cherry on top. I'd like to note that all of this is merely speculation. None of the former employees I spoke to could give me any official word about why the game was never released. But based on other info we have available, it's intriguing to try and piece together the situation. For the time being, it's going to be as close as we'll get to concrete answers. After an absolute rollercoaster of a journey, this was the end, at least for now. When I set out to make this documentary, my goal was to clear up this mystery, and I think I've done that in quite a few ways. There were so many facts contradicting each other, which my research has managed to set the story straight on. We confirmed the real developer of the game, which is pretty significant. I'd learned so much about Terraglyph as a company and peeled back the curtain just a little bit for saving Mean Bob's development. I was kind of proud of this, but also a little let down. I think the most agonizing thing was that somebody out there has all the answers. Somebody knows the full story behind this game. Unfortunately, I clearly haven't spoken with that person yet. My biggest hope upon releasing this documentary is that it may prompt a new Terraglyph employee to come forward. Seeing that there's a passionate online fanbase of people who want to learn the stories behind Lost Media might convince one of the employees I've contacted to get in touch. There were multiple contacts I initiated conversations with, but ended up being ghosted by. If releasing this video convinces them to speak, then there could be another twist in his fascinating tale. And that's where you come in. Yes, you watching this video right now. I need you to help me get the message of this video out. Leave a thumbs up, a comment, share the video with friends, on social media, post it in any online community you're part of. The bigger this video gets, the greater the chance we have of finally finding CatDog saving Mean Bob. Who knows, maybe a year from now we'll have actual gameplay footage. So with my search for Nickelodeon's lost PS1 game on hiatus for the foreseeable future, it was time to put my feet up and rest. Or so I thought. What if I told you Cartoon Network was allegedly making a Mario Party clone in 2015? A game that never saw the light of day. In fact, it was never seen at all outside of an alleged logo. Was this game even real? It was time to get back to work and figure out if Cartoon Network Block Party was more than just an urban legend.